The moisture comes before the light in the A Shau. Not rain, something heavier, something that lives in the triple canopy and falls when it decides, cold and deliberate against the backs of hands. By first light, the fog had sealed the valley walls on both sides, and the 6 men moving in single file through the draw could not see the ridgeline above them. They didn't need to. They had memorized it before the helicopter banked away. This was not contested ground. That distinction matters. The A Shau Valley had belonged to the North Vietnamese Army since March of 1966, when the last American defenders fought their way out of a camp that was already burning around them. In the years that followed, the North Vietnamese had built something in that valley with no equivalent elsewhere in South Vietnam. A logistics corridor so layered, so professionally maintained, that it functioned less like jungle and more like a supply system with trees over it. Roads, vehicle parks, anti-aircraft positions with overlapping fields of fire. The men who built it had lived there for years. The men moving through it that morning had been there for 48 minutes. 6 of them. Long-range patrol, F Company, 58th Infantry, 101st Airborne Division. Their mission was not to fight. It was to see, and to stay invisible long enough to report what they saw. No crew-served weapons, no mortars. The radio weighed nearly as much as everything else combined. If the North Vietnamese found them, there would be no defensive perimeter. There would be a call and a calculation. How long until the helicopters arrive, and how long until the enemy closes the distance. In the A Shau, those 2 numbers had never worked in anyone's favor. Men like these don't ask to be remembered, but they deserve it. Subscribe now and hit the bell, because what the man at the front of that column was about to realize had no name in any contact report ever filed. Something in the understory ahead had gone quiet. The birds that had been moving through the canopy 10 seconds ago were gone. No wind, no rain, just a silence with a different weight. And the man leading that file already knew what silence like that meant in the A Shau. Nobody had taught him. The valley had. He stopped moving. Not a command. A hand raised, fist closed, and 5 men behind him went to ground without a sound. His name was Staff Sergeant Calvin Pruitt, F Company, 58th Infantry, 101st Airborne Division, and he had been listening to those birds for the last 40 minutes. The pattern had been consistent since the team crossed the first draw. A pair of laughing thrushes working the understory ahead and left, vocal and irritable, moving with the team's noise signature the way birds in undisturbed jungle pull away from anything that smells wrong. Now they were gone. Not flushed. Gone. Which meant something ahead of them had been there long enough for the birds to decide it belonged. Pruitt didn't move for 90 seconds. He counted them. 20 meters back, Specialist 4th Class Danny Okafor, the team's radio operator, Cleveland, Ohio, 22 years old, 14 months in the 101st, had one hand on the prick 25 handset and his eyes fixed on the back of Pruitt's neck. Okafor knew the signal for emergency extract. He also knew Pruitt would not use it until he was certain. And in the A Shau, certain came right before it was too late. He had grown up reading silences. Harlan County, Kentucky. Coal country. His father had told him when Calvin was 9 years old that a mine that stopped making noise was a mine that was about to kill someone. The lesson hadn't been about mines. By 1969, Pruitt had been in Vietnam for most of 3 years, across 2 tours. He hadn't arrived in the 101st through any romantic calculation. Harlan County in '66 had three things: coal, hard weather, and a draft board that worked fast. The Army made him a paratrooper. F Company made him something harder to name. Long-range patrol was not an assignment you requested without understanding precisely what you were requesting. 6 men, enemy territory, no artillery within range, no reinforcement until the helicopters arrived. In the A Shau, the helicopters always arrived late. He carried his father's compass in his left breast pocket. Not issued, not useful under triple canopy, where the sky never came through clean. He carried it because it had been in his father's hands 5 days a week for 30 years and had come home every night. He didn't have a more complex reason than that. Okafor was from Cleveland and had never wanted to be anywhere near Southeast Asia. This was not something he said. It was something visible in the particular economy of everything he did. The man who had accepted an impossible situation and decided to be exceptional at it because the alternative was dying of something preventable. He ran radio for F Company with a precision that Pruitt had never seen, matched in 2 years of pulling teams through bad terrain. Pruitt trusted him completely and had never told him so, because telling a man what he meant to you was not something you did until you were outside the wire, and the odds of having to carry him home had dropped below 50%. Now, Pruitt was counting sounds. The A Shau Valley ran roughly northwest to southeast, 25 kilometers long, flanked by mountains that caught the monsoon clouds and held them. The North Vietnamese Army had controlled it since '66, and in the time since, the People's Army had transformed the interior. They had cut roads into the valley floor and carved vehicle parks under canopy, too dense for aerial photography to penetrate cleanly. They had pre-positioned anti-aircraft assets along every viable helicopter approach route. They had built a supply corridor connecting Laotian border depots to the coastal provinces. Fuel, ammunition, replacements, moving south through the night. The 324 Bravo NVA Division had been the dominant force in this sector for 3 years. Their soldiers knew this ground the way miners know shafts, by feel, in the dark, from memory. F Company's patrols were the intelligence effort that made precision targeting possible. Their teams had mapped road networks, identified anti-aircraft positions, established vehicle movement patterns, and fed data to Division S2 in a stream that slowly built a picture of what the North Vietnamese were moving and when. It had cost the company 14 wounded and 7 killed since the 101st moved north after Tet. Every man in the company knew those numbers. Every man knew which missions had produced which casualties. It was not the kind of knowledge that produced fear exactly. It was the kind that produced precision, the determination to do the work in a way that did not add to the count. What the last hour of movement had been building toward was the suspicion, growing now toward conviction, that the team was being shadowed, not pursued, shadowed. The distinction mattered enormously. Pursued meant the enemy had decided the team was more valuable, dead. Shadowed meant the team was more valuable as a lead, to an observation point, an insertion pattern, a coordinate the division was building toward. The 324 Bravo had adapted specifically to LRRP doctrine over 18 months of accumulated contact. They didn't need to search for 6-man teams. They needed to decide when to act on what they were already watching. Pruitt knew all of this before the bird stopped. The bird stopping was confirmation, not information. Before the shooting started, They were young men on both sides of that tree line. North Vietnamese, American, all of them trained, all of them carrying orders that made sense to whoever wrote them. If you've studied this conflict from another angle, if you've found accounts of how NVA counter-reconnaissance elements operated in the A Shau, what their doctrine was, what they understood about the patrols they tracked, add what you know below. Understanding both sides isn't weakness. It's the only honest way to tell a story like this one. The compass was in Pruitt's breast pocket. His right hand rested on the CAR-15. His eyes hadn't moved from the tree line where the birds had been. Something was in there, and it was waiting for him to make the first mistake. On the eastern ridgeline, 300 meters from the draw where Pruitt had stopped, Trung Si Pham Duc Hung lay in the undergrowth and counted the seconds since the movement below had ceased. He had not ordered his team to open fire. He would not. Not yet. Pham had been operating in the A Shau Valley since the spring of 1967, when his unit, a counter-reconnaissance element of the 324 Bravo Division, had been moved south from Quang Tri to address a problem that had no elegant solution. Small American teams were beginning to penetrate the valley, observe the road network, and call in strikes with a precision that ground-based air defense could not consistently defeat. The response was not to reinforce the anti-aircraft batteries. The response was to stop the teams before they reached their observation points. The response was men like Pham Duc Hung. He was 24 years old. He had grown up in Tay Binh Province, in the Delta lowlands north of Hanoi, where the paddies ran flat to a horizon that was also the sky. He had never seen mountains before his unit crossed into the valley's western approach through Laos. The mountains had taken him 4 months to understand. He understood them now in the way a man understands terrain he has slept in, walked in, been sick in, and buried comrades in. Not as geography, but as consequence. Pham had tracked 14 American long-range patrols into this valley over 18 months. Of the 14, 11 had been managed. Redirected without contact, his team had followed closely enough, with enough deliberate audibility, that the Americans had sensed the presence and called for extraction before establishing their observation points. 3 had resulted in contact. Pham did not think about those 3 in terms of the men who died. He thought about them in terms of the technique failures that had produced contact in the first place. A counter-reconnaissance team that made contact had failed. The objective was never contact. The objective was control of the space between the Americans and their helicopters. This team was different in one specific way that Pham had noted within the first hour. The lead man read the jungle correctly. He had stopped at the precise moment that Pham, in his position, would have stopped. That was not a common quality in American patrols. The aggressive ones were predictable. They moved toward their objectives with a momentum that made them readable. This man moved with awareness of what the valley was watching. He adjusted. He counted. He did not panic when things felt wrong. The most dangerous enemy was not the aggressive one. It was the patient one. Pham's orders for this type of situation were established by doctrine and confirmed by experience. Shadow the team until it established its observation point. Note the reported grid coordinate when the team transmitted. Follow the transmission frequency back to the operational picture the division was building. A single 6-man patrol was not the intelligence target. The operation their intelligence supported was the target. The road network was not the target. The unit that used the road network to plan its next movement against North Vietnamese positions was the target. He had a complication. The lead man had stopped and gone silent, which meant he suspected something. If he called for extraction now, before establishing any observation, Pham lost the thread. If Pham moved to closer position to maintain contact, he risked the confirmation that would end the mission. He needed the Americans to keep moving, to believe for 30 more minutes that their discipline had been sufficient. On the valley floor below, nothing moved. Pham's youngest team member, a soldier named Bin from Hanoi, who had a daughter he had never met, born while he was in the valley, lay 40 meters north with eyes on the creek drainage that led to the secondary landing zone. Bin was Pham's best counter-tracker and had the particular patience of someone who had stopped expecting the war to resolve on any timeline he could anticipate. He had been in the valley for 11 months. He had not gone home. He would not go home until the mission permitted it. And the mission had not yet reached a point where it permitted anything. Pham understood, with the clarity that 18 months in the same terrain produces, that the men below him were not the enemy of his personal hatred. They were the obstacle to a mission that he had been trained to believe was necessary and had long since stopped needing to believe anything about. The difference between belief and routine, in his experience, was the difference between the first 6 months and everything after. The men below were doing their work. He was doing his. The valley was simply the place where two sets of work produced consequences neither side fully controlled. The American lead man still hadn't moved. Pham gave him 30 more minutes. If the team resumed movement toward the truck park, he would follow at distance and manage the outcome. If they called for extraction now, if the lead man's instinct was good enough to abort the mission, he would let them go. There was always another team. There was always another week in the A Shau. You don't have to have served to feel what these men felt on both sides of that ridge line. You just have to be willing to sit with it. With the weight of two soldiers, each doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, each carrying men behind them who had trusted the right person to make the call. Subscribe if you're willing, and if this moves you, hit like. This channel doesn't glorify war. It honors the people who were sent into it. The 30 minutes began. Pruitt gave the hand signal to move. He hadn't heard anything that confirmed his suspicion. He hadn't seen anything he could name. But the absence of birds was enough, and the calculation he'd run during those 90 seconds of stillness had produced the same result 3 times. Staying in place gave whatever was tracking the team time to consolidate. Moving produced data. Reaction pattern, spacing, proximity. All of it legible in movement, invisible in stillness. He moved. The team resumed in 2-man intervals, 8 meters between each pair, slow enough to place each foot deliberately on root or stone, never on leaf litter, never on anything that shifted or compressed under weight. No sudden transfers, no deadfall contact. F Company spent more time on movement technique than on any other skill because, in the A Shau, movement was the primary survival tool. The difference between a team that came home and a team that didn't was often not what happened in contact. It was the 30 minutes before contact. The humidity under triple canopy was total. Not rain, but saturation. A density of moisture that the body absorbed alongside everything else it was processing. The canopy overhead filtered the morning light into something directionless and gray. Not darkness, but a diffusion that made depth perception unreliable. Trees 40 meters out read as 15. The valley had that effect on new teams. They made constant errors of distance, reacted to shapes that were logs, failed to identify shapes that were men. After 2 months in the A Shau, you stopped trusting your eyes for range and started navigating by the behavior of the canopy above, the angle of water flow in the drainages, the acoustic signature of sound off close terrain features. Pruitt ran this translation the way a man reads familiar road, not step by step, as continuous background process. Okafor moved second in file. The Prick 25 was 23 additional pounds on top of everything else he carried, and the weight had long since stopped being something he registered. What he registered was the handset against his right thigh, the specific pressure that confirmed it was there, that it worked, that the battery had been tested at 0430. Behind Okafor, Staff Sergeant Ray Torres, San Antonio, Texas, 23 years old, second tour, the team's point man on extractions, moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had internalized the one rule that kept people alive in this terrain. You do not hurry when hurrying is what gets you killed. The truck park was 2 kilometers northeast. Their observation point, a ridgeline spur with a cleared sight line to the valley floor, was 40 minutes of careful movement from current position. What Pruitt couldn't see from his position was that Pham Duc Hung had already moved. The moment the American patrol resumed, Pham adjusted. His team of 4 split into 2 pairs and began paralleling the American movement, one pair tracking on the right, one moving ahead to the northwest. To the northwest was the secondary landing zone, a narrow clearing in a creek drainage that appeared on American aviation maps as a viable extraction point. Pham had used it conceptually 11 times. He knew how long it took a patrol in contact to reach that clearing from this part of the valley. He knew the average time between a first radio call and helicopter arrival. The gap between those 2 numbers was where his leverage lived. The forward pair's job was to own that gap. Bin moved with the forward element. He did not hurry. Hurrying was the technique of men who had not spent enough time in the A Shau to understand that the valley rewarded patience and punished urgency in equal measure. The team crossed a creek drainage stepping stone to stone, and the valley's smell changed at the waterline. Below the canopy, close to moving water, the air carried the specific rot of vegetation that had been wet since the last monsoon. Organic matter returning to soil in cold layers, faintly sweet. Mineral. Above it, barely there, something purposeful and petroleum-based. Not vehicle fuel, lubricating oil. The kind used to maintain a rifle, not run an engine. Recent. Close. Within the last hour. Pruitt didn't stop. Stopping would confirm what the smell was already telling him. Instead, he adjusted course 5 degrees to the left, away from the source, maintaining pace. The team adjusted behind him without signal. F Company's teams, after enough combined time in the field, developed something that had no good name in the training manuals: shared situational awareness, the team as single organism, processing identical data in parallel and drawing identical conclusions with a half-second lag that kept discipline intact. 6 men thinking one thought, adjusting together, staying quiet together. The sound came from his left, 2 seconds long, something mechanical and brief, a component under tension releasing, or a sling swivel settling against a barrel. Not vegetation movement, not weaponry being handled. Something functional, ambient, the kind of sound equipment makes when a man who has been still for a long time shifts his weight by 2 centimeters. Pruitt filed it. He did not break stride. He knew, somewhere below conscious calculation, that the original mission had already ended. They were not going to spend 4 quiet hours at the observation point, counting vehicles on the valley floor. That version of the mission had closed sometime in the last 90 minutes, probably before the birds stopped, possibly earlier. The new mission was simpler and considerably harder. Keep moving, maintain silence, collect whatever intelligence the movement produced, and reach extraction while the option still existed. The question was the window. How much of it remained? 40 meters east, Pham watched the 5-degree course correction and felt something he recognized as professional acknowledgement. The lead American had smelled the oil. There were soldiers who would have stopped, gone to the radio, elevated the situation prematurely. This one had adjusted his bearing and kept moving. That was exactly correct technique. That was precisely what Pham would have done in his position, and the recognition of it was not admiration. It was a data point. The man he was following knew what he was doing, which meant the next decision would be made by someone who had already correctly read 2 out of 2 signals the valley had offered him. Pham raised 4 fingers. His partner acknowledged. 4 minutes. The forward pair would be in position at the secondary landing zone. The American team's primary extraction route would be managed. He had not decided to kill them. He had decided to own the ground between them and their helicopters. Those were not the same decision, and the difference between them remained, for now, navigable. Pruitt's left hand found his breast pocket. His fingertips settled on the shape of the compass through the fabric. The case that had been in his father's hands 5 days a week for 30 years and had come home every night. He didn't open the pocket. He didn't need the compass for direction. He needed to know it was there. The observation point was still 30 minutes away. The sound he'd heard 2 minutes ago had not repeated. It would. He just needed to be listening when it did. Behind him, Okafor's hand rested on the handset. He just hadn't keyed it yet. They had been moving for 20 minutes when Torres found it. He stopped, turned back, and held up 2 fingers pointed down. The signal for a man-made object. Pruitt moved up, crouched beside Torres, looked at what Torres had found, and felt the particular quality of stillness that comes not from fear, but from information arriving faster than the mind can sort it. It was a vehicle park marker, a stake driven into the soil, notched twice at the top in a pattern the NVA used for distance gradients on route maps, not aged. The stake had been placed within the last 48 hours, which meant there was a route the division didn't know about, running along the drainage east of the known truck park, positioned specifically to avoid the detection corridor that F Company's previous missions had established. Pruitt looked at the marker for 3 seconds. He looked at Okafor. He looked back at the tree line. This was the data, not the truck park. This. He pulled out his map, hand-annotated over 4 months, the paper soft from compression against his body, and located their position against the drainage line and the tree geometry above them. He estimated the route the marker was supporting. He estimated where it terminated. His pencil made 3 marks that together said, "Secondary access road, running parallel to the known route, offset east by approximately 600 meters, terminating at a vehicle park that did not appear in any existing intelligence product." 3 marks on soft paper. 1 grid coordinate that would take a week to confirm by air and could be confirmed right now by a man with eyes. The observation point was 15 minutes ahead. The secondary park would be visible from it. If they kept moving, Pruitt would have a full grid, a vehicle count, a confirmation of the route gradient. The 324 Bravo had spent 3 years building something in this valley that American planners didn't fully understand. And in the space of 1 morning, 6 men had wandered to its edge. He looked at Okafor again. Okafor's expression was the expression of a man who had already completed the calculation and was waiting to see if Pruitt came to the same number. What would you do? Not in theory. Not in a classroom. Not in a debrief. Not looking back from the distance of 50 years. Right now. 6 men. 14 months since you arrived in country. The best intelligence of your unit's career within 15 minutes of footstep. The extraction window narrowing. A sound you couldn't identify 30 minutes ago that you have heard twice since. The bird's gone. The mission already changed. Do you push for the grid that justifies everything this company has paid for this valley? Or do you call it now with what you have, and trust that partial data transmitted alive is worth more than complete data that never leaves the jungle? Pruitt made the decision the way he made most decisions that mattered. Not all at once, but in layers, each layer eliminating one option until one remained. He had the route marker. He had a grid estimate accurate enough to direct initial targeting. He had a drainage line that confirmed the route existed. That was enough to act on. Not enough to confirm. Enough to act. He tapped Torres twice on the shoulder, the signal to turn the team around. Then he reached for Okafor's handset. There is a version of courage that looks like advancing. There is another version that looks, from the outside, exactly like retreating but isn't. Pruitt had been in the 101st long enough to have seen both, and he had stopped needing anyone's opinion about which was which. He keyed the handset. He gave the team's call sign. He transmitted the route marker grid in a burst, 30 seconds of speech that contained everything the division needed to begin working the drainage line and a request for extraction at the alternate landing zone. The secondary clearing north of the primary, farther from FAM's forward pair, harder to reach, but outside the managed space, Pruitt could feel tightening around the team's primary route. The response came in 12 seconds. Extraction confirmed. 14 minutes. Pruitt handed the handset back to Okafor, looked at the marker stake one more time, and stood up. He didn't know it yet, but the transmission had been heard. Not its content. The encoding was clean. But the fact of a transmission, its duration and frequency signature, reached Pham Duc Hung on the eastern ridgeline in the form of information that changed everything about his calculation. A call of that length on that frequency meant extraction was inbound. It meant the Americans were leaving. It meant the window for passive management had closed. Pham made his decision. Torres began moving north. The team folded in behind him. 14 minutes. The valley was quiet in the specific way it went quiet when something had already been decided. They were 6 minutes from the alternate landing zone when the bamboo thicket started wrong. Torres held up a fist and went to one knee. Pruitt came up beside him. The thicket was a narrow stand of giant bamboo running along the creek drainage, dense enough to require single-file movement, the canes pressing in on both sides, the canopy closing overhead. It was the only viable path to the alternate LZ without adding 12 minutes of open movement across a draw that Pruitt did not trust. He had chosen this route specifically because it didn't appear on the aviation approach maps as a natural obstacle. Meaning Pham's team, if they were reading the extraction options the way Pruitt would read them, might not have covered it. He looked at the thicket for 4 seconds. Torres looked at him. Pruitt went in. The bamboo was cold and slick with morning moisture, the canes thick as a man's forearm, and the space between them barely wide enough to move through without the barrel of the Car-15 catching. The team moved in absolute silence. no brush against nylon, no metal contact, no footfall on the dry bamboo debris that accumulated at the base of each stand. 5 seconds in. 10. The light inside the thicket was different from the triple canopy. Greener, more diffused, filtering through green walls instead of a green ceiling. 20 seconds. What Torres couldn't hear, because it was 40 meters north of the thicket's exit point, was Ben settling into position at the creek drainage clearing and raising his hand to signal FAM's forward pair. In position, landing zone visible, waiting. They had covered the wrong clearing. The alternate LZ was 200 meters north of the primary. Ben had been given the primary's coordinates when the team split. The correction, 200 meters, a different drainage, a clearing that didn't appear on the same map grid, arrived in FAM's head as the American patrol exited the bamboo and broke into the open ground of the alternate LZ at a pace that was no longer careful. It was fast, the kind of fast that meant someone had made a calculation about time and committed to it. FAM's secondary pair was 2 minutes behind. Pruitt hit the clearing edge and keyed the handset. He gave the LZ designation, gave a compass bearing for the approach, and said one word after the grid, hot. He didn't know for certain. He said it because uncertain was not a condition you reported to a helicopter crew when the answer to, is it hot, required you to be wrong before you found out. The response, 8 minutes. 8 minutes was a different number than 14. It was also a very long time to stand in the open. Torres moved to the south edge of the clearing and went prone. Okafor took the north. Pruitt positioned the remaining 3 men on the east and west approaches and moved to the center, where the helicopter would need him visible for a fast approach and load. He stood in the clearing and did the thing that went against everything his training had built into his body. He stopped moving, stopped hiding, made himself the most visible object in the space. This was the turning point. Not a moment of revelation. A decision made in a clearing, in the open, under canopy that stopped 20 meters back and left no cover between him and whatever was coming. He had done everything the valley demanded. He had stayed silent. He had read it correctly. He had given ground rather than fight for position he didn't need. The one thing left was to be exactly where he needed to be. 6 minutes out, FAM's secondary pair reached the clearing perimeter. The first round went wide. The second did not. Torres was hit in the upper left arm. The round through and through, bone intact. The arm functional enough that he rolled right and got his own weapon oriented in the time it took Pruitt to identify the muzzle flash in the tree line. F Company's contact drills were not complicated. They were built on one principle. You don't break contact by running. You break contact by making staying more expensive than leaving. Pruitt, Okafor, and 2 other team members returned fire into the tree line with the controlled cadence of men who were not panicking because they had agreed, collectively and in advance, that panicking was a tactical decision they could not afford. FAM heard the exchange from the ridgeline and understood in the first 10 seconds that his secondary pair had initiated too early, from the wrong angle, against a team that was already in the open and oriented. He understood in the next 10 seconds that the helicopter was already inbound. He understood in the 10 seconds after that the thing he had spent 30 minutes avoiding had arrived. Contact managed poorly, on the enemy's terms. The lead American had chosen the moment, not the valley, not FAM's team. That was the difference. The helicopter came in low from the northwest, the approach bearing Pruitt had given, and it did not slow for a gentle landing. It flared hard at the clearing edge, and the crew chief was already pointing at the men before the skids touched. Torres went first, Okafor second. The team loaded in 23 seconds. Pruitt covered the tree line until the last second, then turned and ran the 10 meters to the aircraft. He was the last man on. The A Shau dropped away below them as the helicopter climbed. Pruitt looked down at the drainage, the bamboo thicket, the creek line he had followed all morning. It was just green. The valley looked, from altitude, exactly like what it was: terrain. Indifferent, unchanged. The mission had passed through it and left no visible mark. Below, Pham Duc Hung watched the helicopter until the sound was gone. He had the transmission frequency. He had a grid estimate based on the route marker's likely terminus. He had, in his own notes, a partial picture of an access road the Americans had found. He would pass it up the chain. Someone above him would make a decision about what to do with the information. 2 days later, at a position 600 meters east of the known truck park, something that had functioned quietly for 3 years would not be there anymore. The A Shau did not remember either of them. It had work to do. The helicopter set down at a forward operating base 20 minutes after extraction. Torres walked off under his own power, the field dressing on his arm already soaked through, and already not his primary concern. His primary concern was the same as everyone else's: the specific animal inventory of the team after contact, the silent calculation that begins the moment the aircraft leaves the ground. Who is accounted for? Who is moving? What is missing? Okafor was the one who counted. He counted 6. He said the number once, quietly, to nobody in particular, and then sat down on the edge of the landing pad and put the prick 25 down beside him. 6 out of 6. The number that didn't always come back that way. Pruitt sat on the pad and didn't move for a long time. He was not injured. He knew this the way you know the absence of something. The body checks itself automatically after contact, catalogs its inventory, reports back. Nothing broken. He reached into his breast pocket and found the compass. He pulled it out for the first time since insertion. The brass case had a dent in it that hadn't been there at 0430. A crease across the lower left face, from the same round that had passed through Torres's arm and continued into the area of the pad where Pruitt had been standing for 23 seconds. The compass needle still moved freely. It still pointed the direction it had always pointed. He held it in his hand for a while and then put it back. There was a man on Pham's secondary pair named Chau Van Son from Nghệ An province in central Vietnam, 21 years old, the youngest member of the counter-reconnaissance element in the A Shau for 4 months. He had been one of the 2 who moved to the clearing's perimeter 6 minutes too late, and from the wrong angle. In the exchange of fire, Chau Van Son was hit once. He died before Pham's team could carry him back to the main position. Pham wrote the report. He wrote the name correctly. He noted the date and the grid and the circumstances. He did not elaborate on the circumstances. There was nothing to elaborate. The team had made a tactical error. The result was what results always were. He folded the report, put it in his pocket, and looked at the clearing for a long time before the team began moving back to the ridgeline. He had a daughter in Tai Binh province. He had not been home in 11 months. The date on which he would go home was not knowable. He had stopped trying to make it knowable. That night, the A Shau did what it did every night when it had finished what the day required. It went dark and it went wet, and it moved its supplies south. the engines running without lights, the drivers navigating by the stars when the clouds allowed, and by memory when they didn't. The road that F Company had found that morning was quiet now. It would be quiet for another 36 hours. Then it would be something else. In a debriefing room at the forward base, Pruitt walked an S2 officer through the route marker, the drainage line, the estimated terminus. He described the position of the vehicle park he had not reached. He described the approach bearing, the canopy density, the ambient sound signature of the drainage. He answered questions for 40 minutes and gave every piece of what he had seen with the accuracy of a man who had been trained to retain exactly this kind of information under exactly this kind of duress. It was good intelligence. It was not complete. It was what he had been able to carry out. The S2 officer thanked him. He asked about Torres. He asked about the team. Pruitt said the team was fine. He didn't say that the number 6 out of 6 was a number the company didn't always produce. He didn't say that the weight of standing in the clearing for 23 seconds in the open was a weight he would still feel in 20 years when he tried to explain it to someone and found the words didn't exist. He didn't say that the compass in his pocket had a dent in it that would still be there in 1996 when his daughter asked him about it, and he told her it was from the mine. He didn't say any of that. He said the team was fine. He said it because it was true and because he had learned in 3 years that what was also true, the things that were also true, that lived in the same space as the team is fine and were not contradictions and could not be resolved. Those things did not belong to debrief rooms. They belonged somewhere else. He had not yet found where. F Company ran another mission into the A Shau 9 days later. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years. And the weight never got lighter. Calvin Pruitt left Vietnam for the last time in the spring of 1970, when F Company, 58th Infantry, was deactivated as part of the reorganization that folded the division's long-range patrol program into the newly designated 75th Infantry, the Rangers. The men scattered. Some re-enlisted under the new designation. Some rotated home. The relationships that had been forged in 6-man teams in enemy territory had no institutional address after that. And the Army, which is an institution built for many things, has never been particularly good at preserving the specific weight of what small units leave behind. He went back to Kentucky. He did not go to the mines. His father had died in '68, 2 weeks before Pruitt's second tour ended, and the mine had closed the following year. The seam played out. The company moved on. The way companies move on. Pruitt found work with the Forest Service, maintaining fire lookout stations in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and later in Western Virginia. Elevated positions, long sight lines, the requirement to observe and report without being observed in return. He was not making an ironic choice. He was making the only choice that felt structurally familiar. He worked the lookouts for 22 years. He kept the compass on a shelf in his house in Harlan County. Not in his pocket anymore. He took it down occasionally, not for navigation. It had never been useful for navigation, but for the specific weight of it in the hand, the way the needle moved when he tilted the case. It still pointed north. It still worked. The dent on the lower left face was still there. His daughter asked about it once when she was 11 years old, and he told her it was from the mine, which was not a lie exactly, because the mine was where the compass had come from, and the A Shau was a different kind of mine, one that operated on the same principle, that went quiet before it killed, that gave back what it took in forms you couldn't always identify. He told her that part later, when she was old enough. Pham Duc Hung survived the war. He returned to Tai Binh province after 1975 and spent 30 years as a school administrator in the province's secondary system. His youngest daughter became a teacher. He attended reconciliation events in Hanoi in the 1990s, where veterans from both sides occasionally met, and he shook hands with Americans when offered, without difficulty, in the manner of a man who had made his peace with the work he had done and the reasons it had been done, and the distance between those reasons and the outcomes they produced. He said once, through an interpreter, that the Americans he had tracked in the A Shau had been professionals. He respected that. He was asked if he thought about them. He said that he thought about Chow Van Son, whose name he had written correctly in a report, and whose family he had visited once after the war. He said that was the thinking that mattered. What happened in the A Shau in '69 was not in the newspapers. F Company's missions did not produce headlines. The intelligence their patrols generated fed targeting cycles that produced arc-light strikes on targets that appeared in no press coverage. Facilities destroyed in valley sectors nobody was reporting from. Roads cut that were rebuilt within days. A war of position and counterposition conducted below the threshold of any narrative the public was receiving. The men who ran those missions understood this. They understood it before they volunteered. The understanding had not made the choice simpler. It had made the choice their own. Pruitt did not spend the years after Vietnam questioning whether the missions had mattered. He knew they had mattered, tactically, specifically, in ways he could trace through S2 reports and strike assessments. What he carried was a different question, one he had not found a clean answer to in 50 years, and which he had stopped expecting to find, because the question was not the kind that produced answers. It was the kind that produced continued carrying. He knew, from the specific way the valley had felt on the day they extracted, that the men on the other side of the ridgeline had been doing their work with the same quality of commitment, the same professionalism, the same willingness to put themselves in the space where the outcome could not be controlled. He didn't need to forgive anyone for that. There was nothing to forgive. There was only the valley, which had held them both, and the space between two sets of quiet men trying to complete their missions, and the cost that the space eventually required. On a shelf in Harlan County, a compass needle points north. It still moves freely when you tilt the case. If you served or knew someone who did, their courage was real. Their sacrifice was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to let these stories disappear into silence. Share this if you believe it matters to tell it honestly. Honor the warriors. Question the wars.